The views and opinions expressed are those of the presenters and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any company. Any content provided should be considered their opinion and are not intended to be interpreted as an endorsement. Today's topic is a look into the life of a scientist solving a problem. Welcome to our Solutions for NanoAnalysis podcast, brought to you by Bruker NanoAnalytics. We look forward to bringing you a new podcast regularly. My name is Cody Morton. I'm a marketing communications specialist at Bruker NanoAnalytics and an information enthusiast. If you like to learn from specialists in their field and hear what technologies are solving their problems, you will enjoy this podcast. Every session, we will focus on a different problem that our colleagues face in the lab and in the field. Some of the solutions will be a variation of ideas you may have heard before or even worked with. We will bring you these topics in a new and interesting way and introduce you to updated and thought-provoking results. We will talk about how the problem was dealt with in the past and what we're doing to solve the problem now and perhaps even envision future solutions. Join us as we talk solutions with a variety of scientists and technicians in many different industries in the Solutions for NanoAnalysis podcast. Thank you for joining us today. We have Jess, Chloros, our object conservator for Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, and Gianfranco Pocabene, chief paintings conservator there at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum.
Thank you.
Thank you both for joining me. Jess, you are the objects conservator there, and we're talking paintings. Were you involved at all in the conservation for this particular piece?
That's a great question. So I was not involved in the conservation or restoration of this piece, but I was involved in the technical, scientific technical analysis of this piece. Our conservation department does not have a staff scientist, and I have done multiple different workshop trainings with X-ray fluorescence. And so in our lab, I am the pseudo XRF scientist. And so one of the great things is that I end up collaborating a lot with my colleagues on different analysis projects.
Jess, were you interested in science as a young child, as a student, or did that kind of fall into place after you realized you could do so much more with conservation, given the more science you add to it?
Yeah, I think as a younger person, I was more interested in the art and art history classes. But as I learned about the field of conservation and started working towards that as my career goal and going to graduate school at the University of Delaware, I, really had a firsthand experience with all of the different kind of analytical tools that are available to conservators. And, it hooked me.
Very good. I think it's one thing that when I meet art conservators, they are art enthusiasts first and art lovers and humanities studies people that just kind of got bitten by the science bug once they started realizing how those two things could go together so well. I love it.
Yeah, they go great hand in hand. They really do.
And then Gianfranco, I assume that this was a project that you oversaw from beginning to end. Were you involved in deciding what piece you would work on to conserve, or was this just list of 1, 2, 3, 4, and you finally got to this piece that needed conserved?
That's a great question. So, the conservation department here at the Gardner, we have a sort of a master plan of what needs to be worked on over the course of the next 4 or 5 years, whatever it is. But we also have to not collaborate, but we have to coordinate that with loans and exhibitions. So things that might be going to another museum, traveling, as in the case of the Titian, which it did do over the last year and a half, and also any exhibition we have here. So often those two things, the need for an object to be worked on and, it coincides with an exhibition or a loan, then we integrate that into our work schedule to make it happen, which was the case here with the Titian, that we were looking at it as a conservation project, but not one that had to be done immediately. But then with the exhibition, we, had to do all the work that we did to prepare it for that.
So with a conservation, this is not a small piece. It's by means probably not the largest piece there at the museum, but were you concerned about timing since you did have this project kind of a finite time it had to be done in? Were you a little nervous getting started that you might not be able to finish?
Yeah, no, actually, I think we were reasonably well prepared. I mean, there were a lot of discussions going on well before we actually started doing any technical analysis or any conservation treatment. Because it's a big deal. In fact, the one thing that everybody needs to be aware of that this is one of the most iconic works of art in the museum. Some people would argue it's the one, but yeah, whatever. In the country, it's an amazing painting. It's a really significant painting, and it was a big deal because the painting had never been loaned. It's never been out of the museum, and so there were a lot of issues in terms of how can it travel? Is it safe? But in terms of the schedule, we had a lot of prep time in terms of, okay, this is really happening. And then we started talking about, well, what does it need in terms of any potential treatment, whether it was structural, and we can get in that later in terms of how it physically could travel. And then also the aesthetic component, which is, did it need cleaning? What kind of restoration needed to be done? All those things were worked into that. And then the other big part of that was, before we do any treatment, typically, and this was a much more involved and comprehensive treatment than anything that we would typically do, but this was really, digging into all the sort of information we could learn about the object before we worked on it. And so then, we started talking, Jess and I, about what are the technical things we're going to do aside from infrared imaging and, UV light imaging, all the X-rays that, we might need. So we had a good chunk of time, but yeah, we were on a schedule. And of course, the other big piece of this is that nobody wants to see the painting off view. So there was a lot of juggling, and it worked. There were phases that we worked on in terms of the structural work and some of the technical work, and then it went back on view, and then we did the cleaning, and then of course it was gone for well over a year before it traveled to London and Madrid.
You worked in the gallery at one point.
There was a lot of juggling. It's a big deal, and we had to sort of dance through all those schedule things, but I don't feel like we were ever stressed about. We had enough time, so that was good.
These exhibitions are planned very carefully, especially a large multi-venue international exhibit like this.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And so we're talking about the Rape of Europa, which is Titian's one of 6 pieces that were commissioned for or given to King Philip II.
Commissioned, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And this is the first time in just years and years and years that these pieces have been back together and they're now traveling. Is the Gardner Museum the last location that they're at as a group?
Yeah, we are. We're the last location. I think it's close to 500 years. It's
about
450 years since they've all been together. So we are the only North American venue for this show, and in January the other paintings will go back to their permanent homes, and ours will return to its gallery, which is called the Titian Room.
Oh, very good. So the other pieces, 2 of the pieces hang together in the National Gallery in London, and then the other pieces, are they together as well in Spain, or did they come from single collections themselves? They
come from single collections. So the Diana and Callisto and the Diana and Actaeon are the ones you just mentioned, which are London. And actually, they're shared with Edinburgh. It's kind of the National Galleries of Scotland and them for the credit purposes. Mm-hmm. And then the Venus and Adonis is Madrid. So you remember where that come from. And then the Danae, which is a piece from the Duke of Wellington collection at Apsley House in London. And then the final piece is Perseus and Andromeda, also in London at the Wallace Collection, is where they all reside.
And then Isabella Stewart Gardner had procured this piece herself. And has conservation work been done on it before of any sort? Is there work that gets done on some of the larger pieces annually or regularly?
So some of the collection does need sort of somewhat, we would call it regular maintenance. It's kind of like dusting and making sure that you don't get sort of surface grime accumulating. The paintings, typically they have varnish coatings on them.
Mhm.
So they'll last a lot longer in terms of, there's a bigger interval between the actual treatments. But as for the Titian, it's actually kind of remarkable because, as I said, it's like the iconic painting in the collection, and it actually received very little conservation attention or treatment, and also technical work, which is why we were so interested in actually this project. It had been studied a bit back in the late 80s. It was.
Yeah.
There'd been some initial kind of pigment studies, but nothing very comprehensive at all. But as for the conservation treatment history, there's a note in our conservation records that say that in 1920, late 20s, 28, 29, Thompson, who was the conservator restorer at the MFA across the street, worked on it for a couple of months. We don't know what he did. There's no record of what he did. They didn't typically document what they were doing, but we think he gave it kind of what we call a selective cleaning, where you sort of remove parts of the varnish to lighten up brighten up the figures or whatever the case may be. But he left a lot of the old varnish in place. And then there was also another light surface cleaning in the I guess it was the 80s too, where it was just a surface cleaning, but not dealing with the varnish, which is what we dealt with in this current treatment in a big way.
That was probably good that they didn't do a lot of extra work in the last 100, 200 years, wasn't it?
Yeah, that would be good. Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of objects, not just paintings, a lot of objects, did get damaged during treatments, cleanings, and it's one of the unfortunate aspects of the field.
Often we're dealing with the consequences of past restorations, and if they had just been left alone, they may be in better shape. But you do the best that you can, and you try not to judge those that came before you, because we certainly have more resources now.
Yeah,
absolutely. Now, do we have notes of why or how Isabella Stewart Gardner procured this piece, or why this piece? Or was she just she knew Titian was a artist that she wanted to have more pieces of?
Well, she was clearly a very avid collector, and she had a wide interest in a lot of things. I mean, we have Oriental material from the Far East. We have Egyptian material. I mean, she was very what's the word? Catholic or eclectic in her collecting tastes, and compared to a lot of the other sort of like Frick and Morgan, she didn't have that kind of money to do this sort of thing, but she collaborated a lot with Bernard Berenson, who was an important, significant art historian in the late 19th century and into the 20th century. And but there were also a lot of other people who helped her, but he was the significant contact she had in Europe to collect Western paintings. I mean, that they did that a lot, and he was always searching things out. And of course, he got a good, healthy commission to do that work. And so, but they had a very close relationship in terms of, it wasn't just a business arrangement. They were actually great friends, and so it was one of those great moments where a collector is working with a great art historian and amassing a pretty significant collection. And in fact, the Titian is really significant too, because it's the first Titian in America. We have a lot of those, actually. She was on the forefront. She was buying things in a very in a new way, in a way that other collectors weren't even aware of. And so we have a lot of firsts in this museum of objects and paintings that American collectors were not interested in yet.
Yeah, it's amazing when you visit the museum, just her mind and her appreciation of the art and what was available was so clear and so forward thinking. It doesn't look like every other collection you might have seen. And there's a reason, because it's an amazing collection. You can't even imagine what her contemporaries were thinking when she made some of the selections she did. I'm sure they're probably tutting some of the ideas that she had going forward, which is probably why she was so strict with her. Don't get rid of stuff. Don't change stuff. Right. I know what I'm doing.
And she did.
She did.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. When you started to approach the restoration, conservation, you had mentioned, it sounded like a great timeline. Was there anything that you started working on and were surprised by, whether it it took a little longer than you expected, or it was a little better than you expected as far as needing restoration?
So overall, the whole project, and I'm not just talking about the conservation restoration, but the technical work and, collaborating with Bruce Kaiser and Aaron Sugar, who's a professor at Buffalo, who he did some really amazing work with the XRF mapping. We can get that again later, collecting data, but then putting it all together into these fantastic maps, elemental maps. The whole project totally exceeded, I think, all of our expectations, aesthetically, technically, the outcome. I couldn't be more proud of what we accomplished, and the work that went into it was just phenomenal.
Do you have before and after pictures of the spaces?
We can provide,
Oh, that would be terrific. I think our listeners would really get a kick out of. That's one of the visual things.
And great elemental maps. So that'll really, for the science geeks, that'll really, that'll be exciting.
I love it. I love it. Yeah. We love geeking out about a good elemental map. That's for sure.
We do too. Yeah.
We found our people.
So when you started working on this piece, it's on canvas, isn't it?
Correct.
Okay. Did you find, did Titian do what his contemporaries were doing, reusing canvas, or because this was commissioned, he was able to afford not to have to reuse? Did you find a lot of brush strokes that had been covered over, redone? Did you find any mysteries behind the fabric or something?
No, the fabric is pretty standard. The interesting thing from a materials point of view is that he was in an amazing place, which was Venice in the Renaissance. And, Venice was the major port in Europe, which was importing and exporting materials all over Europe, into Asia, into Africa. So he had access to everything in terms of, pigments and they were big canvas makers there also, in Italy. But no, he didn't, there's nothing in the materials he used that was out of the ordinary or extraordinary. Mm-hmm. What's really extraordinary is actually the way he paints. That's what sets him apart. Mm-hmm. It's how he applies paint to the canvas. Mm-hmm. So that's the phenomenal part about his work and why he was such an important and influential painter in the Renaissance.
And to that point, he did not make many changes
in our painting
in particular. Yeah. I think it's also interesting that our painting of the 6 Poésie paintings was the last one that he painted. Mm-hmm. And if you look start to finish, ours is the kind of most impressionistic, if you will, kind of dramatic, but the brush strokes are looser and a little more gestural. So you do see a bit of an evolution, I think, throughout the 6 paintings. I was going to mention the canvas, just that I think it's interesting for listeners to know that when you look at the painting, you see a vertical seam down the center. And that's because they actually had to seam 2 sections of canvas together because, am I right, that the technology is, the loom was about as wide as your arms could span. And so if you needed a canvas larger than that, you had to piece them together. So from a material point, that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, and that doesn't change much until later in the early 19th century when Industrial Revolution creates these massive looms, and you can make a 20-foot wide piece of canvas if you need that. So
And then as you were working, were you thinking back on this is easier now when I have the elemental mapping, when I know what I'm working with, when I see why this is like it is, thinking back 100 years to conservators trying to do this without the technology?
So I think maybe we'll do a little back and forth here because this is actually the most interesting aspect, I think, of what we did. Removing varnish is removing varnish. Of course, it's a petition and you're really careful, and the amount of restoration is also a big deal. Mm-hmm. But so what's interesting about the painting is we knew that from the earlier pigment studies, there was this finding that there was a blue pigment that he used called Smalt, Smalt. And it's a ground glass, cobalt glass material that came into favor in Europe in the Renaissance and into the Baroque. And it wasn't a substitute for ultramarine, which is the very rare mineral coming from Afghanistan, it's the present-day Afghanistan at the period. but it's a material that got introduced into the palettes of a whole bunch of painters. So we knew that there was this smalt material in the painting. We didn't know to what extent it covered the painting or where it was exactly. Well, we had an idea where it was, but we didn't know specifically where it was. And in terms of the painting's condition, even with a very yellow varnish on the surface, you could tell that the upper right corner of the painting quadrant, clouds and sky, had a very funny look compared to the rest of the picture, which the painting is actually really incredibly well preserved. Mm-hmm. So there was this question of what had happened to the sky in the sort of from the half portion up to the right-hand corner, upper right-hand corner. And it had this funny look, which was this kind of, it looked like there was a red earth underlayer. Clearly it had been abraded, the paint layer. And the one thing I want to say is that Titian, in this case, this painting especially, painted exceedingly thin. Yeah. It looks like there's a lot of paint on this painting. There is not. It's actually very direct, and he got what he wanted pretty quickly, it looks like. So there was this funny look to the painting, and we were concerned about, well, what caused this? Why does it look like this? And that's when the conversation started about, okay, well, we need to start doing some analysis. We had X-rays already, but they don't tell you much because it's only, heavy elements that you're seeing, but you can't distinguish between if it's lead white or something else. Mm-hmm. So one of the things we do typically, and Jess can jump in here, is basically start doing spot analysis. But I'll let you take over then.
Yeah, so we have had a handheld Bruker XRF since 2013. And we have analyzed a lot of paintings. So we feel, comfortable with that. And so, it was like, well, let's see what's happening here. So this is a large painting. So we did a lot of spot analysis. I think 38 different spots, basically looking at different colors to try to assess what pigments we had, what maybe combinations of pigments. And it was great, and it gave us good information. But, I think the difficulty with all spot analysis is it tells you what's in that very spot, but, 1 inch over, it could be totally different. And that's when we started thinking about mapping. And it was great because I knew that Aaron Sugar at the Buffalo State University Conservation Program was doing a lot of XRF mapping. And so we got in touch with him and Bruce Kaiser from formerly, retired from Bruker. And we got this little team together, and it was this fabulous project that just formed. And we were able to do mapping with a Bruker handheld Tracer 5i. Yeah. And the amount of data that we got was overwhelming.
I mean, it was something
300,000 points or something like that.
And we weren't even doing it in a very detailed way.
Right. I mean, we could have gone even finer, but because of the scale. Yeah,
the painting is a little over 80 inches wide by 70 inches high. So, I mean, we couldn't do it on, a micro level, scale. But we needed to just get a general sense of what elemental kind of, distributions and we had. And, exactly. Yeah. So, we gathered all of this information, and then Aaron made, these beautiful maps where we could pull out element by element. So we could have a map of the whole painting, a calcium map, and then we could overlay a cobalt map and an iron map and start to pick out the patterns and really, use those kind of detective skills to figure out why is this area different from that area. So what was really amazing was what we discovered. And as Jess just said, you're like, it's like a needle in a haystack. I mean, you find a bit of it, but what does it mean? The significant thing was going back to this blue glass pigment, Smalt, which in fact was distributed over a huge portion of the painting. It wasn't just in the upper right. We discovered that it went basically right across the sky and down into the mountains before you get to the water's edge. And that was quite mind-blowing to think it was all there. And what we realized is what Titian had done was he actually applied this layer of smalt over that whole field. He blocked in a huge area. And again, this is really interesting too, because at that time, if you compare it to Florentine painting, there was this school of thinking that you had to design it. It was called disegno in Italian, but you would do a drawing, a preparatory drawing, you keep doing studies, you'd work it up, you'd work up the composition, you would transfer it to the canvas, and you had it basically worked out and pretty well perfect by the time you started painting, and you started painting away, and that was it. The Venetians, and especially Titian, didn't do that. He barely drew. I mean, on our painting, the other interesting part of the analysis was the infrared imaging, and you can see these broad kind of strokes of black paint, kind of hard to call it an underdrawing actually, but it's like a sketch basically, but just like indicating certain forms, a very loose, very kind of not haphazard, but just kind of very casual looking. So he's working in a very modern way. When you think of, painters just going up to the canvas and start doing, doodling. And if you think of modern, like expressionist painting in the 20th century, they're just like tossing paint at it.
They're not making preparatory drawings.
Yeah. And he was basically kind of doing the same thing. And it's more, it's more specific and refined, but the attitude is the same. It's this very modern kind of like, I just start working it out on the canvas. I'm not preparing anything. I've got this idea, and it's part of the process of how the painting's going to look. So the smalt, was just covering the upper half of the painting. And this explained a lot of things, because then what he did was he finished the rest of the painting, worked through that, put in the figures, and there are the two putti at the top left part of the image flying into the scene. And those were painted in. And then pretty well towards the end of the execution of the painting, he applies this blue ultramarine layer, which covers the left-hand portion of the sky. And that part of the painting is actually in really amazing condition. The ultramarine is in oil paint, in a linseed oil or whatever he might have used, in this case, walnut oil, is very stable. And so what we think happened to explain this dark kind of look to the right-hand side of the picture was that previous cleanings and restorers were cleaning away, and they're getting this beautiful blue in the left-hand side of the picture. And as they move to the right, it just stays this dark gray kind of material, which is the problem with smalt, actually, is that we know that especially when it's mixed in a drying oil, it deteriorates. It starts to lose its color. So the color in that area had shifted from probably a pale gray kind of color with the clouds to a dark brown, almost black kind of color. And so what probably happened is restorers were cleaning away. They're trying to get the right-hand side to look as bright as the left, and they keep cleaning.
They keep cleaning.
And because Titian painted so thinly, what they've done is rub right through portions of the canvas, to the painting right down to the canvas. And what we were seeing, that dark red-brown, was the canvas starting to be exposed. So that's why it looked like that, which was very, very odd. And it really explained what had happened to our picture.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you looked with an optivisor or under the microscope, you could see the canvas threads, really. You could see the nubs. So the nubs, where woven.
And in the recesses where, the lower parts, you can still see some of the remnants of this smalt paint looking very dark and gray. And so that was significant in understanding what had happened to it. And then it also informed us on how to restore that area. But we can get to that also when you want to talk about that.
Yeah, well, I was just getting ready to ask, as a conservationist, when does the fix it part of you kick in, and how do you edit that from, well, they've messed it up, I need to fix it. Titian wanted it the canvas should not be seen. I need to go in and fix it with some cobalt or something. Or do you just leave it as a error that has been made that we learn from?
So there's no straightforward answer to that question. And every object, every piece of furniture or painting or ceramic, these are questions that we always have conversations about. And working with the curators too is like, how do you want this thing to look? What's the end goal, basically? So sometimes, with a lot of things, we won't do a lot of restoration because it stands on its own. It's accepted the way it looks is acceptable. Paintings are a little different in that, they are two-dimensional. And so
have a history of, being worked on, being revarnished and cleaned. So there's a little more.
Yeah. And in fact, the interesting comparison is sculpture. Mm-hmm. If it's missing an arm, I don't think Jess would recreate the arm.
No, we usually don't. It's a very different sensibility.
And it's also just three-dimensionally. For some reason, a missing arm doesn't seem as disturbing as when there's a hole in the painting or something. Especially
if you're talking, ancient sculptures. I think we all accept the age and that they've lived a life.
Yeah. So basically, how we go about it is, as I said, every object has its own history, its own condition, sort of history. The materials are very specific to it. So we juggle a lot of factors into the conversation about how we go about restoring it. And so what happened with the Titian was, once we knew what had happened to the picture in terms of the degradation of the smalt, we removed the varnish. That was, I never like to say straightforward, but it was without incident. I mean, it went the way we thought it was going to do. There was a lot of testing, and we had a lot of analysis done actually with our colleagues at the MFA to determine what it was. And we won't want to forget the most important part of this.
Yeah.
One of the more important things about the XRF analysis and the mapping was, typically, we also like to take cross-sections, small microscopic samples that inform us about the structure of the original paint layers. And it could be on a polychrome sculpture, it could be on a canvas. And we want to understand what's the original. We can distinguish the restoration layers that might have been added on top of that. Are there varnish layers that have degraded? What's the composition basically of the object we're working on? So before this advent of XRF mapping, you would just basically say, well, I'll go here and I'll go there. And you hope for the best result in terms of what you find. And as Jess said earlier, you don't always get what you think you're going to get in terms of the analysis. The mapping really made us intelligent about where we were going to take these cross sections. We only took 15 cross sections, samples from the painting.
Right. And just to back up 1 second is that, we love as conservators to be as non-destructive as possible. And so XRF is a fantastic tool for us because it gathers so much elemental information without even having to touch the picture. And so that's wonderful, but, you can only tell so much from that. And so with a project like this, that's going to be, significant. And we want to this is our opportunity. We're not ever going to get this opportunity again in our lifetime to learn as much as we can. So it warranted taking physical samples.
Yeah.
But like you said, the mapping made us so intelligent because
there was a real strategy behind what we were doing. Yeah.
So much. We could really focus taking a sample from a particular area where we knew we could answer maybe 2 or 3 questions.
Yeah.
Instead of, just
taking 3 samples.
Right. So it reduced the number of destructive sampling we needed to do.
Yeah. And the strategy was also, okay, now we know that the smalt layer is underneath the ultramarine. Let's take a sample that includes those 2 and see how he created that surface. The other thing that's critical about cross-section work is that we can then not only look at it under a microscope and do UV images, et cetera, but then from that, you can go on and do scanning electron microscopy. You can do medium analysis. I mean, there's all sorts of other things.
Without having to resample, you can recycle your sample.
Which we did with Richard Newman at the MFA. And it was interesting to just do the SEM analysis and corroborate what the XRF analysis was finding.
Yeah.
And so, it's just, how far do you want to go with the information you want to gather. But that was a huge thing in terms of, understanding how he worked and how we were going to take these cross sections. That was really significant actually for the project.
I think it was eye-opening for us, really.
Yeah, because really you're not doing it in the blind before you have this, but you're kind of, you might miss something. And, it was really, really significant for us to be able to do that in a very intelligent.
It felt really safe.
Yeah, and methodical. Really methodical. We're really like doing this in the the best way we can at this moment, anyways. Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So I think your question then was about how we proceeded with the actual restoration work.
Yeah.
So again, the mapping was really significant because we could look at here's where all the cobalt was for this smalt pigment. And one of the really beautiful things, and I hope we can include in the presentation you put together, is even the calcium map, which was really fascinating. Typically, that gets mostly covered over,
And it's usually the gesso, the ground
layer.
It's
the ground there. He applied a gypsum layer to the canvas, sort of just to block out sort of the color of the canvas. Again, very thin, and it was the instrumentation was it's amazing that an element like that was sensitive to calcium, but it actually showed up in all the areas where it had been abraded. So where the paint was gone, that previous restorers had removed, the calcium's lighting up. So we know these are areas where there had been overcleaning. Yeah, overcleaning had occurred. So that also informed, okay, so how much of this do we want to do? But ultimately, in terms of how we go about the restoration, in this case, we're talking about what's called retouching or in-painting of damages and losses or abrasions. Mm-hmm. The first thing we actually decided, and we try to do that as much with any object, is to really be minimal about the amount of restoration we do. Because we've seen so many examples of like over restoring and covering things over that shouldn't have been covered. Repainting, exactly. So that's an attitude we have generally, I think, in most museums. I mean, it's just, that's
in the field.
It's a standard kind of thing. In this case, I think we wanted to be even more cautious because, again, going back to the fact that the painting is in such great condition, we really want Titian to shine and not any work that we're doing.
Right.
I mean, we should only be doing things that make the painting look a little better in terms of balance. And that was one of the big things. Once the varnish was off and some of the overpaints that it was on there was off, there was this discrepancy between the really well-preserved parts of the painting, like 3/4 of it.
Like the ultramarine,
brilliant
it was
blue. Spectacular.
So
spectacular. And then this area that was a problem. And one of the we're talking all about technology and science, but one of the things that we really relied on too was the fact that about 70 years after Titian painted it and it went to Spain, Peter Paul Rubens, the next generation of great painters in the 17th century, he's on some sort of mission. Like it was like more of a political thing. He goes to Madrid. He's supposed to be there for 2 weeks. He ends up staying for like 8 months because he sees Titian and he starts making copies, a lot of copies. And the Prado still has a lot of the copies there. It's really amazing. So he's studying, the great master before him. And what's really, again, incredible, he was like 50 years old. He ruled Europe in terms of the commissions he could get, but he's still learning from Titian, which tells you how significant Titian was to the following generations of painters. So he actually made a copy of the Rape of Europa. It's in Madrid at the Prado. And, when you look at that painting, he didn't use Smalt. He probably didn't know what exactly Titian was using. And his copy, the upper right hand of the sky, is not dark. It's not black. It has clouds and it's grayish. It's not as intense as the left side. But so we had further evidence of what the Titian might have looked at. Again, we don't want to presume that we know exactly what it looked like. We don't know. There are no color images. There's no way of knowing. So in terms of the retouching, there were a lot of pinpoint damages that were a little disturbing in the middle of the painting, the sky. So those were like specifically touched out. In the upper right, basically, I used what Jess was referring to earlier, that you could see the degraded Smalt still sitting on the dark red-brown canvas substrate. And so really it was a question of just going in there with a loupe and a lot of lighting and touching in the disturbing dark brown parts of that area that really read all wrong. So we lightened it up a little bit, but not everywhere. It was kind of a literally spot stippling kind of approach to, it's not a big brush. It's a very
small brush for a very big painting.
Yeah, very, very few. It took forever. I mean, that was
the most time
consuming part of the project. It was hundreds of hours of in painting, and a lot of conversations with the curator and the rest of the conservator, like, what are you seeing? Everything, yeah, and we had people coming in too because it was such a big deal. So really, it was to sort of neutralize and push back those disturbing parts of the picture that didn't go with the rest of the painting, yet keeping it as minimal as possible. And just so, for lay people, or not scientists, but people who don't know about conservation, we don't use original kind of like oil paints that the artist might have used. Those things will degrade and then you can't get them off easily and it causes all sorts of problems. So we're using very stable synthetic resins and pigments and varnishes that not only will not discolor over a long period of time, but when they're to be removed in the future, they'll come off with really mild solvents. Yeah. So we're thinking about the next conservator who has to deal with these objects and how easy we can make it for them in terms of removing what we would have done at this point.
And then, Gianfranco, you said that when you were working on this project for the larger traveling of the piece, that you had to make some considerations. What were some of those considerations for shipping a piece to multiple locations?
So another huge aspect of it, because we got into the whole mapping thing, which is really fantastic.
Yeah.
Actually, before we ever think about aesthetic considerations with any treatment, or especially for a loan or traveling, we're always concerned about actually the structure of the object, the painting in this case, and that it's going to be safe to travel. And in fact, in our initial kind of examinations, what we didn't mention earlier is, so there's the original canvas that Titian painted on, and Jess described the two pieces that were sewn together. But on the reverse of the painting, there's what's called a lining. It's a secondary fabric that was attached to the painting, we think somewhere around 1800. And the reason we say that is that it too is composed of two pieces of twill fabric. There's a seam running down the back of this lining fabric. So we know again that it's probably pre-industrial revolution. Yep. And just the way it was woven, it just looked earlier than anything sort of in the 19th century. It was very early 19th century, if that, maybe even late 18th century. So generally, we found that the adhesion between those two fabrics, the lining and the original, was really good. But along the edges, we started seeing separations, and they were applied with, bonded together with an animal glue and probably a flour. It was a kind of a traditional thing that was used to adhere, in this case, linen canvases. And as I said, it generally was in really good condition, but along the edges, there were separations that were occurring. So that was a little concerning. More critical was the strainer that it was on, and this is the frame, wood frame that that this canvas is stretched over, and it's not an expandable one, which is what we call a stretcher. This is a strainer. It's basically nailed at the corners and the cross members, so it's immovable. You can't tension the painting mechanically with the wood support. So that was in actually pretty horrific condition. There was a lot of old woodworm damage. The joints were very weak. There were splits. The cross members had actually bowed really badly. They were really kind of not, in plane anymore. So, that was a huge concern. This is going to, and initially it was going to be a 4-venue exhibition. Because of the pandemic, Edinburgh had to back out, but it was going across the ocean, and for those who don't know, we're talking about, even if you put it into a crate and it's well packed, it just goes onto a truck. It rumbles all the way down to New York, and then it's flown over. Trucks and it's just, there's a lot of handling, and it's something we never like to see with any object, even if it's in really great condition. So actually, and it was a significant part of the project that happened just after we'd gotten into a lot of the technical work, the analysis work. Yeah. And there's a funny side story to this, which is really interesting, actually. But let me describe what we did structurally, which was basically, I decided that the strainer that it was on would not serve the purpose of supporting the painting for this trip.
The painting was very
loose, slack on the. It's kind of like kind
like
of
a sail,
like flopping.
You don't want that.
Not a good thing, because you think of vibration on a truck or whatever it is, and it's just flopping along. Not good. And you're concerned about the edges of the painting, the lining fabric, which is it's like tearing. So that's a huge concern. So what we did is we took it off that strainer, had a custom built stretcher built for it, and won't get into the details, but it basically incorporated a rigid panel support system embedded into it. We set that into it. It still functions as a stretcher, but the painting, if you pushed on it, you couldn't push it back from plane. It would just basically stop there. So it was attached to this, but before we did that, we applied what's called an interleaf, another piece of fabric, linen fabric, as a kind of a cushioning. So this was all put together, and we were really happy with that result. But the interesting story is that we actually started doing the analysis with the gantry and everything.
We started doing the mapping before the structural work. But we'll go back and forth, but it was really fortuitous, actually, that something went wrong. Yeah, something went wrong. I think we had, a couple of weeks that we were going to do the mapping. And
everybody wants you to do this really fast.
Really quick and get it back on the wall.
Get it back on view. It's like, insane.
Legitimately, visitors come here, and that's one of the paintings they want to see. Yeah, so we had started doing the mapping, and it was great until the day that the instrument stopped working.
We'd only done like one or two passes, right?
Yeah.
Or should you describe the dimension?
Oh, yeah. And the gantry we were using, the the size that we could scan was about 30 centimeters by 40 centimeters.
So 40 maps, basically, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So about 40 maps. And we would overlap them a little bit so that we knew we got, the whole surface. But yeah, the instrument needed to be repaired. So we were like, whoops, but that's okay because we sent it back to Brooker, who they were great about doing the repair, but it took a couple weeks, I think. Yeah. And so very smartly, Gianfranco decided to use that time to do the structural treatment. Which
we'd all figured out. We had the stretcher already. Yeah. Everything was like ready to go.
Right. It just wasn't the order we had planned it. Yeah. So we had to be flexible. And what was fabulous is that before he did the structural treatment, as we said, the canvas was, a little undulating and it wasn't perfectly flat.
And even our climate control with the air movement, it would flop a little bit.
Waving a little,
Not good when you're doing...
When you want to be really perpendicular and have your exact distance when you're doing mapping. So it turned out to be such a silver lining to have the structural work done. The repaired instrument comes back and then we get back into doing the mapping with a much more planar surface. So
not moving,
not at different depths. So that ended up being a happy accident.
Yeah.
Wonderful. And so when it got back to the Gardner, Gianfranco, did you go and watch it uncrate and stand there holding your breath, or you were confident by then that it was fine?
So the pandemic threw a massive monkey wrench into everything. Typically what we do when we loan things and they're traveling, there's a courier from the museum. It's usually the conservators, that go with it. Sometimes it could be, if it's not an object we're too concerned about, it could be another staff member, a curator or whatever. But typically we go along with it. It gets uncrated at wherever it is. We condition it. It gets hung or installed. And we go back home and then, when it's coming back, we do the same thing. So this last round, I actually back in March of, God, I don't even know what year, 2020. End of February.
End of February, yeah.
Just before all hell broke loose. I actually went with the painting to London. We uncrated it and they created these whole new frames. So they got framed and it got glazing in front of it, installed it, fabulous. And then they had shut down everything went on.
You barely got back.
And I barely got back.
A scurry.
Yeah, it really was. And then basically, we could not go back to Europe to condition the paintings because that's something that we do standardly. So basically, we relied on our colleagues who are also great conservators and registrars, and they did the conditioning. And of course, then it had to be trucked to Madrid, and we couldn't be on the trucks because half the countries are shut down, and you're not going to get through. But before the painting came back, actually to the Gardner, I did go. What was it? A couple of months ago before it came here. I went to Madrid, spent a day conditioning it. We crated it up, loaded it up on the truck, and waved bye-bye as it went all the way to Liège in Belgium, which was the shipping port for the cargo flights. So, and I won't get into the cargo flights because that was a whole other, rigmarole in terms of shipping everything. But it was kind of stressful. But again, we rely on our colleagues just to and in fact,
we would do the same thing,
in fact, when all the paintings came here, none of the couriers came from the other institutions. So we were doing live Zoom video conditioning.
Like with an iPad.
And we're like, and I see this, and what do you think? We made it work. It was really weird, but we made it work, and it was fine.
We're a very collaborative field in general, and I think the pandemic has made it even more so, we're forced to do things a little differently than we're used to.
So we go to all sorts of steps to make sure we don't have surprises. You're always anxious, did it travel well?
Right. But it's always nice to see it.
Yeah, everything was fine. Yeah, everything was fine.
When all the pieces were originally put together after the Rape of Europa had been conserved and sent over to join the other pieces, was there any, I'm thinking, had the other pieces been conserved as well, or was there any thinking, oh, well, that one looks really good because it got conserved most recently, and this one, not so much? Or are you able to, as a conservator, as an exhibitor, display it in a way that doesn't draw attention to that?
So ours was the most, obviously the very recent treatment. 4 of them had been treated in the last 15, 20 years.
Okay.
So they're fine. The one exception is the Perseus and Andromeda from the Wallace collection. which was last treated or cleaned and restored in the late 70s, if I remember correctly. Mm-hmm. But that painting had a really kind of unfortunate history in that it was traveling a lot. It kept getting sold and given, and it had over 30 transits in its life, which is outrageous.
It's a lot of transactions.
And when you think of in the Renaissance and the Baroque, it's a cart with straw and it's not modern packing
it's
material.
Not crates. And,
and air ride trucks.
Air bumpers.
So it had a really unfortunate history. So it's compromised, and the restorations need to be done again. But I have to say, it hangs
right next to ours.
Yeah, it's on the left. Ours is on the right. And in spite of its condition, Titian is such a great painter. It just holds its own. It's really amazing. Even in a diminished state, it's still a really powerful, beautiful painting.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it has a great sea monster.
Yeah.
So,
and blood.
I mean, who doesn't like that?
It's
You can appreciate it.
But it too has and several of the other paintings also have this smalt problem again of skies looking really weird because they're no longer the color that they were originally.
That's really fascinating. Thank you so much. Well, I just appreciate your time so much. This sounds like such a great piece of study, and I hope everybody is able to get to the Gardner Museum, if not before the large exhibition closes, at least when the Titian room is back to full peace and all of the restoration projects that you have going on in there get done. Thank you to our speakers today. If you would like more information about today's topic or to submit a topic idea, please email info.bna@bruker.com. You can also check out more information in today's show notes. Join us next time as we look at a new solution with more scientists and technicians in all sorts of industries.